Daviki ma'am? Daviki ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, let us start, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Good evening, one and all. Let us start our national level webinar with the blessings of God Almighty. I am Dr. Sangeeta, Head PG Department of English, Tiruvallur University Constituent College, Kallakurichi. I feel immensely honored to present the welcome address as an organizer of this webinar. And at the outset, I feel immensely honored and pleasure to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. S. Thamari Chelvi ma'am, and our respected registrar, Dr. Syed Shafi sir, and our constituent colleges director, Dr. Dandapani sir, and our dean, Dr. Tangaraj sir, for their appreciation and permission to conduct such webinars for the welfare of the students and the staff members. Next, I welcome our fellow participants for their active participation in our Tiruvallur University Constituent College Kallakurichi's webinars. Without you, the program would be nothing. I welcome you all and thank you. Next, I welcome our second session resource person, Dr. Devaki from Government Arts and Science College, Kongayam. Welcome, ma'am. I welcome one and all. Thank you. Let me start my presentation, Introduction to Literary Criticism. Slide. Yes. For the centuries, literary criticism as an art of writing poetry, it was an advice to the poet rather than the reader. Literary criticism has been applied since the 17th century to the description, justification, analysis, or judgments of works' arts. Criticism in modern times is classified in different ways. W.H. Abrahams in The Mirror and the Lamp talks about 4 different critical theories when the critic views art in terms of universe or what is imitated. He is using the mimetic theory. When the emphasis is shifted to the reader and the critic views art in terms of its effect on that audience, he is using a pragmatic theory. That was dominant up to the end of the 18th century. And but in the 19th century, the emphasis shifted to the poet, and poetry became a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling of the poet. In this case, a work of art is essentially the internal made made external. Therefore, when a critic views art in terms of the artist, he is using the expressive theory. In the 20th century, the emphasis shifted to the work of art, especially under the influence of the new criticism. When the critic views art basically in its own terms, seeing the work as a self-contained entity, he is using the objective theory. Some critics have talked about theoretical and practical or applied criticism. Theoretical criticism attempts to arrive at the general principles of art. Practical criticism applies these principles to the works of art. Literary critics have also talked about other types of criticism. That is, the historical criticism examines a work of art against its historical background and the author's life and time. Impressionistic criticism emphasizes the way that a work of art affects the critic. Next, the textual criticism applies scholarly means to work of art to reconstruct its original version. The analytical criticism tries to get at the nature of a work of art as an object through the detailed analysis of its parts and their organization. Judicial criticism judges a work of art by a definable set of standards. Moral criticism evaluates a work of art in relation to human life. And mythic criticism explores the nature and significance of archetypes and archetypal patterns in a work of art. So these are all the some critics have talked about the theoretical and practical or applied criticism. Next, we can see the history of literary criticism. The literary criticism begins with the Greeks, but little of their work has survived. Aristotle's poetics is mostly devoted to drama, and Plato's theories of literature are scarcely literary criticism. From the Romans, the major works are Horace's Ars Poetica and the works on rhetoric composed by Cicero and Quintilian. The first important critical essay in the Christian era is Longinus's On His Sublime. And the first medieval critic of note was Dante, who in his De Vulgari Eloquentic addressed himself to the problems of language appropriate to poetry. The Renaissance writers and critics, for the most part, followed the classical rules on the principle that the ancients were bound to have been right, but there were some attempts at originality. For example, Vida's Poetica, treatise on the art of poetry, Du Belli's Defense at Illustration, and Lope de Vega's New Art of Making Comedies. In England, there is little criticism of note until Putenhand's The Art of English Poesy and Sidney's Apology for Poetry, which is important because it is a detailed examination of the art of poetry and a discussion of the state of English poetry at the time. For nearly 100 years, the major critical works to appear tended to reinforce the classical tradition of classical tradition and rules. Some of the main works were Ben Jonson's Timber or Discoveries, Pierce Corneille's Discourse, Boileau's Art Poetic, with Dryden, however, in his essay of dramatic poesy, not to mention his prefaces, dedications, and open-mindedness, whose critical essays are works of an art in themselves. If anybody showed the way to the people, function of the criticism. In the 18th century, G.B. Vico, Italian critic and philosopher, was the pioneer of the historical approach to literature. And historicism, as it is called, completely changed in the long-run critical methods. It enabled people to realize that the rules that held good for the classical writers do not necessarily hold good in a later age, and that there were not absolute principles and rules by which literature could be judged. There was thus a reaction against neoclassicism and increasing interest in the literatures other than those of Greece and Rome. and a greater variety of opinions about literature, about the language to be used, and about the creative and imaginative faculties and processes of the writer. The new views found expression in Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, Shelley's Defense of Poetry, a reply to Peacock's ironical debunking in the four ages of poetry, and the philosophy of composition, and Matthew Arnold's essay in criticism, the writings of Walter Pater on culture and art, especially the Renaissance and appreciations, had profound influence on critical thinking. By the second half of the 19th century, many different critical theories had begun to proliferate, as is clear from a study of philosophy of aestheticism, the doctrine of art of art's sake, and the work of the symbolist poets. There were fewer rules of any kind as more and more writers experimented. At the same time, the work of the best critics continued in the tradition and method of Vico. Saint Beuve, which is immense range of learning, and his keen sense of critical and judicious detachment was the supreme exponent of historicism. Recent criticism has tended to be more and more closely analytical in the evaluation and interpretation of literature, as is evident in the achievements of major critics like M.H. Abrams, Eric Auerbach, and I.A. Richards, etc. Now let us see what is literary criticism. Sometimes the word criticism puts people off because in every use it has negative connotations. Yes, we usually think of a critic as the kind of grumpy person who seems to exist solely to find problems and stress falls. The word means more than that. However, it comes from the Greek verb kritikos, which means to judge or to decide. In its original sense, a critic is simply a person who expresses an informed judgment or opinion about the meaning, value, truth, beauty, or artistry of something. Literary criticism is the discipline of interpreting, analyzing, and evaluating works of literature. Literature is most commonly defined as works of writing that have lasted over the years because they deal with ideas of timeless and universal interest with exceptional artistry and power. This can include poems, stories, novels, plays, essays, memoirs, and so on. Each of the three main activities of literary criticism are the interpreting, analyzing, and evaluating. Gives rise to different questions. First, let us see the interpretive question. What does this work of literature mean? When we interpret a work, we set forth one or more of its possible meaning. Reading is like a potluck picnic to which the writer brings the words and the reader brings the meanings. Literary works speak to us all in different ways, and one of the pleasure of talking about books is the chance to check out all the different ideas other readers bring to the picnic. This is the interpretative question. Next, we pass on to the analytic question. What is the analytic question? How does this piece of literature work? When we analyze a text, we get under the hood to see how the engine operates. Analysis is technical, pulling things apart, examining relationships, figuring out effects. We are not asking what a poem means anymore, but how the author makes it click. This is the analytical question. Next, we pass on to the evaluative question. Is this work of literature any good? When evaluating work, we form a personal judgment about its work. Is this a great novel or a rotten one? Why? Does this poem have any value? Why? Why does this work of literature add or subtract from the world? So these are all the evaluative questions. So that's why it is said to be the evaluative question. Let us next pass on to the next question. Does literary criticism have any practical use? Yes, the discipline of literary criticism is valuable for a number of reasons, including I'm giving those things for the following. First one is literary criticism improves our general reading skills, giving us more tools to help solve problems of understanding as we read. The second one is literary criticism can help us in college by expanding our awareness of different approaches, thus giving us more ways to respond what we read. The third one is literary criticism supports the development of critical thinking skills. It encourages us to identify our own reading habits and to explore beyond their boundaries. It can also give us a sense of confidence and responsibility about developing our critical standards and judgments and not having to surrender our opinion to others' interpretations. It sharpens our general interpretive, analytic, and evaluative skills. And it improves our ability to make a good argument by encouraging the habit of backing up our opinions with reasons and textual evidences. For all these reasons, literary criticism can help us to develop our skills as an independent thinker and reader. Next, we pass on to the question, what is a literary theory? In literary criticism, a theory is the specific method, approach, or viewpoint a critic or reader has staked out from which he or she interprets, analyzes, and evaluates works of art and often the world. There are numerous literary theories. Some of we may find useful, some not so useful. That's for us to judge. But we should learn how each theory or approach works before us making our final judgment. And I am going to give some essential questions when looking at literary theories. Let us see the questions. What are some of the many different ways a reader can approach a book? That's the main question. How does each work? What are the benefits and limitations of each literary lens? Which critical theories make sense and seem useful to us? Which don't, and why? So these are all the questions we have to ask further, and the literary theories answered for such questions. Next, we pass on to the types of literary criticism. What are the types of the literary criticism? Let us see the first one, the theoretical criticism. It proposes an explicit theory of literature in sense of general principles, together with a set of terms, distinctions, and categories to be applied to identifying and analyzing works of literature, as well as the criteria by which these works and their writers are to be evaluated. The earliest and enduringly important treatise of theoretical criticism was Aristotle's Poetics. That is it. Next, we pass on to the practical criticism. Practical criticism or applied criticism. It concerns itself with the discussion of particular works and writers. In an applied critic, the theoretical principles controlling the mode of the analysis, interpretation, and evaluation are often left implicit or brought in only as the occasion demands. Among the more influential works of applied criticism in England and America are the literary essays of Dryden in the Restoration period, Dr. Johnson's Lives of the English Poets, Coleridge's chapters on the poetry of Wordsworth in Biographia Literaria, and his lectures on Shakespeare, William Hazlitt's lectures on Shakespeare and English poets, and so on. So this is the practical criticism. Next, we pass on to the impressionistic criticism. Impressionistic criticism attempts to represent in words the felt qualities of a particular passage or work and to express the responses that the work directly evokes from the critic. As William Hazlitt put it in his essay on genius and common sense, you decide from feeling and not from reason. That is, from the impression of a number of things on the mind, though you may not be able to analyze or account for it in the several particulars. And Walter Pater later said that in criticism, the first step toward seeing one's object as it really is, to know one's impression as it is really is, to discriminate it, to realize it distinctly, and posed as the basic question, what is thing, song, or picture to me? This is it. As its extreme, this mode of criticism becomes, in Anatole Frank's phrase, the adventures of a sensitive soul among masterpieces. So this is the impressionistic criticism. Next, we can see the judicial criticism. It's, on the other hand, attempts not merely to communicate, but to analyze and explain the effects of a work by reference to its subject, organization, techniques, and style, to base the critic's individual judgments on specified criteria of literary excellence. So these are all the types of criticism. Next, we pass on to the types of traditional critical theories and applied criticism. First is, let us see the mimetic criticism. It views the literary work as an imitation or reflection. Next one is the pragmatic criticism. It views the work as something which is constructed in order to achieve certain effects on the audience, and it tends to judge the value of the work according to its successes in achieving that aim. This approach will largely dominate literary discussion from the versified art of poetry by the Roman Horace in the 1st century BC through the 18th century has been revived in recent rhetorical criticism, which emphasize the artistic strategies by when an author engages and influences the responses of the readers to the matters represented in a literary work. Next, we pass on to the expressive criticism. It treats a literary work primarily in relation to its author. It defines as an expression or overflow or utterance of feelings, or as the product of poet's imagination operating or on his or her perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. It tends to judge the work by its sincerity or its adequacy to the poet's individual version or state of mind. And it often seeks in the work evidences of the particular temperament and experiences of the author, who consciously or unconsciously has 19th century and remain current in our own time, especially in the writing of psychological and psychoanalytical critics and in critics of consciousness such as Paulet and Geneva School. Next, we pass on to the objective criticism. Objective criticism with your work of literature as something which stands free from what is often called extrinsic relationship to the poet or to the audience or to the environing world. And instead, it describes the literary product as a self-sufficient and to be analyzed and to be analyzed and judged solely by component elements. The conception of the self-sufficiency of an aesthetic object was proposed in Kant's Critique of Aesthetic Judgment. PPT in YouTube is not clear. Let's check it. So, this is it. And let us pass on to the 6 approaches to the literature. The first one is historical or biographical approach. The historical and biographical critics see works as the reflection of an author's life and times. And it approaches, this approach deems it necessary to know about the author and the political, economical, and sociological context of his times in order to truly understand the work. Next, the moral and philosophical approach. The moral and philosophical critics believe that the larger purpose of literature is to teach morality and to probe philosophical issues. Practitioners include Matthew Arnold, Plato, and Horace. They are the the larger purpose of literature to teach morality and to probe philosophical issues. Next, we pass on to the formalism, new criticism. A formalistic approach to literature, once called new criticism, involves a close reading of the text. Formalistic critics believe that all information essential to the interpretation of a work must be found within the work itself. There is no need to bring in outside information about the history, politics, or society of the time or about the author's life. Cut the PPT. Formalistic critics spend much time analyzing irony, paradox, imagery, and metaphor. They are also interested in the works of setting characters, symbols, and point of view. Okay. So the next we pass on to the terms used in new criticism. First one is the tension. Tension is the integral unity of the poem, which results from the resolution of opposites, often in irony or paradox. Next one is intentional fallacy. It is the belief that the meaning or value of your work may be determined author's intention. Next one is affective fallacy. The belief that meaning or value of your work may be determined by its effect of the reader. Next one is external form, rhyme scheme, meter, stanza form, etc. Another one is objective correlative. It is originated by T.S. Eliot. This term refers to a collection of objects, situation, or events that instantly evoke a particular emotion. Next, we see the psychological approach. The critics view works through the lens of psychology. They look either at the psychological motivations of the characters or of the authors themselves, although the former is generally considered a more respectable approach. More frequently, Freudian or Freudian psychological works. Now let us see the Freudian approach, the id, superego, and ego. Freudian critics steer toward the sexual implications of symbols and imagery, since Freud's theory that all human behavior derives from libido or sexual energy. Next is the concave images such as fonts, flowers, cups, and caves, that is equal to female symbols. Next, the convex images such as skyscrapers, submarines, obelisks, etc. is equal to male symbols. Next, actions such as dancing, riding, and flying is equal to the sexual pleasure. Then the water is equal to birth, the female principle, the maternal, the womb, and the death wish. Next, the Oedipus complex is equal to a boy's unconscious rivalry with his father for the love of his mother. Next, the Electro complex is equal to a girl's unconscious rivalry with her mother for the love of her father. Then the critics may also refer to Freud's psychology of child development, which includes the oral stage and the anal stage. This is the Freud's approach. Next, we pass on to the Jungian approach. Jung is also an influential force in myth criticism. Psychological critics are generally concerned with this concept of the process of individualization. Jung labeled three parts of the self. The first one is the shadow. The darker and unconscious self rarely surfaces, yet must be faced for totality of self-personae. Next, the persona, the public personality or mask. Next, the anima or animus, a man's or woman's soul image. Next, a neurosis occurs when someone fails to assimilate one of these unconscious components into his or her consciousness and project it on someone else. The persona must be flexible and be able to balance the components of the psyche. Next, we pass on to the mythological or archetypal approach. This approach is to literature assumes that there is a collection of symbols, images, characters, and motifs that evokes a similar response in all people. According to the psychologist Carl Jung, mankind possesses a collective unconscious that contains these archetypes and that is common to all humanity. Myth critics identify these archetypal patterns and discuss how they function in the works. They believe that these archetypes are the source of much of literature's power. Next, we see the feministic approach. Feminist is the criticism, ma'am's is concerned with the impact of gender or writing and reading. It is usually begins with a critique of patriarchal culture. It is concerned with the place of female writers in the canon. Finally, it includes a search for a feminine theory or approach to texts. Feminist criticism is political and often revisionist. Feminists often argue that male fears are portrayed through female characters. They may argue that gender determines everything, or just the opposite, that all gender differences are imposed by society and gender determines nothing. Let me conclude my session by giving the by 2 points that the literary criticism does not require that we all agree about what a work of literature means, how it works, or whether it's effective. We don't even have to agree with any expert's judgment. We have only two obligations when we assert our opinions. The first one is we are obligated to explain as clearly as possible the reasons behind our ideas and back them up with evidence from the actual text we are discussing. The second one is we are obligated to listen respectfully to critics' ideas in the hope that we can learn from learning how others respond to works of literature. So this is it. So this is it. This is a brief introduction to the um, uh, uh, literary criticism. And let me hand over the session to Dr. Devaki. And before that, it's my duty to introduce her in before you. Dr. B. Devaki is doing her service as assistant professor in the Department of English at Government Arts and Science College, Kangayam. She has got teaching and research experience in engineering institutions and arts and science colleges for more than 15 years. Her areas of specialization are British, American literary studies, Indian writing in English, English language teaching, and soft skills logistics. She has presented and published papers on literary theories, communicative skills, and teaching and research methodologies in various seminars and conferences. Her contribution to IACIS, that is Indo-American Center for International Studies, Hyderabad, needs a special mention here. And I welcome ma'am, and I hand over the session to Dr. Devaki ma'am. Ma'am, please welcome.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the introduction. That was a wonderful session by you, ma'am, on you briefed it about literary criticism. That will be useful for the students and scholars, ma'am. That was nice, ma'am. Let me present my screen, ma'am. Just a minute.
Yes, ma'am.
I think my slide is visible now. Sangeeta,
Ma'am,
ma'am?
it is in vertical, ma'am. Put it in horizontal. Yes, ma'am. Now it's visible, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. You continue.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, all. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. L. Sangeeta for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to meet you all. Without much ado, I just want to take you to the outline of my presentation. I have divided my presentation into three parts. Part one will deal with what is new historicism, why and how it emerged, and how it enlarged its range beyond regions. And also, I focus on some theorists and theories. And in the second part, of course, I would like to discuss the difference between traditional historicism and new historicism and introduce some basic methods, also some critics and practitioners of new historicism. And in the third part, I will explain how new historicism becomes a viable theory for the writers and critics to analyze and evaluate literary texts. For that, I have chosen The Bluest Eye, the literary text by Toni Morrison, to explain how the strategies of new historicism revise and rewrite the events written in the historical texts. Why, how new historicism emerged? Why? Because new historicisms were generated. Later, it has become important in the criticisms of British and American literatures. New historicism enlarged its range beyond Renaissance. So let us see how it enlarged its range. Of course, the American critic Stephen Greenblatt coined the term New Historicism. His work, Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare, is considered as the beginning, and the journal Representations consolidated the aims and methods of the movement. The journal Representations has been founded by these three critics, Catherine Gallagher, Walter Ben Michaels, Stephen Greenblatt, and other new historicist theorists. These new historicists have consolidated new historicism not as a doctrine, but as a set of themes, preoccupations, and attitudes. Therefore, the journal Representations brings together the literary critics and historians in a colorful carnival of cultural readings and thick descriptions. The other two important precursors of this movement are Raymond Williams and Michael Foucault. The literary critic Raymond Williams, Marxism and Literature, has inspired the rehistoricization of literary studies in England and America. With his wide-ranging interest in culture and critical methodology, he has made the mid-century historical criticism to move away from the traditional hierarchy of history over literature. Michael Foucault has influenced the cultural critics with his view of history as a discursive practice. New historicism has also been influenced by Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist. Therefore, using Foucault's mode of power analysis, Geertz's thick description, the new historicists evolved a method of describing culture in action. As I said in the beginning, the movement concentrated mostly in Renaissance studies. These new historicists have studied literary texts only to explore the poetics of culture. This exploration draws upon the insights of structuralism and post-structuralism, and the new historicists could understand literature to be rooted in its cultural and authorial connections. Later, it has been developed as an identifiable movement in academic, literary, and cultural criticisms. Stephen Greenblatt's essays on New Historicism, Louis Montroux's study of power and Renaissance poetry, a spate of articles, and many MLA sessions concentrating on ideology and the English Renaissance texts contributed much to the development of New Historicism. So, in a decade, the movement has overtaken several periods on multiple disciplines. New American Studies published well-known articles and exciting essays on the theory of New Historicism in the Berkeley-based journal Representations. Therefore, New Historicism has provided a substantial body of publications. This is how it has enlarged its range beyond the Renaissance to all other regions. Now, let us see some of the influential theories and definitions of New Historicism. New Historicism has been defined by many critics and scholars who inspired the term and determined the characteristics of New Historicism. They introduced a number of different approaches to history and culture, and lump it together under the category of new historicism. So I think it is important to specify some of the influential theories and definitions to provide the general trends and common practices of new historicism. New historicism treats both literature and history as a kind of writing. It proves the point with Derrida that there is nothing outside the text in the special sense that everything about the past is only available to us in a textualized form. The events and attitudes of the past exist solely as writing. Now, this writing has become a subject to the kind of close analysis which has been formerly reserved only for the literary text. Here, new historicism, in dealing with history, takes away the objectivity of history. The traditional historians' pride in being totalized realistic representation and offering a scientific model has become rootless and completely damaged. The past becomes a kind of perpetual present. The perception that runs through new historical belief is that literature must be understood in relation to a redefined or broadly conceived historical context. Therefore, new historicism recommends a parallel study of literary and historical texts. New historicism, based on the method of treating literature and history as parallel texts, the achievement of new historicism is to eliminate the idea of treating history as a background material. It places literary texts within the frame of non-literary texts and treats both as parallel texts. So, in Peter Barry's words, you can see it on my slide. It is a method based on the parallel reading of literary and non-literary texts, usually of the same historical period. That is to say, New Historicism refuses to privilege the literary text. Instead of literary foreground and historical background, it envisages and practices a mode of study in which literary and non-literary texts are given equal weight and constantly inform and interrogate each other. On this basis, non-literary texts need not be treated as belonging to a different order of textuality. New historicism insists that history is an intersection of discourses which establishes a dominant ideology. It emphasizes the necessity to look upon the literary or historical texts as many types of discourses that reveal history. The American critic Louis Montrose defines it as a combined interest in the textuality of history and the historicity of text. It suggests its willingness to investigate all the textual traces of past, like the life of the author, the social rules found within the text, the manner in which the text reveals the historical situation, the ways in which other historical texts can help us understand the text, and the way the critics study them, and all these things. Therefore, there is no access to a full and authentic past or a lived material existence. No writer can assume the historical past, but can partially presume upon the textual traces, which are also considered as a kind of a perception of a writer. New historicists are likely to emphasize the reading of the past in the present situation. The past is informed by the present historical position of the critic. In Frederick Jameson's words, new historicism has been defined as a return of cultural theory to immanence, stressing detail and immediacy as the entry of social and economics into the text. Therefore, any text can be juxtaposed with a chosen document so that a new entity is formed here. The text should be read in relation to each other and also in relation to non-discursive texts or events. New historicism presents a new reality by resituating the past in the present situation. Next, let us talk about thick description. Thick description in new historicism has emerged from Clifford Geertz's anthropological studies. It provides new historicists a new way of thinking about culture in literary and historical texts. The meanings of this text are never entirely fixed, and they are subject to appropriations and aspects. Geet's thick description is the way in which the societies create meaning through offer a specific content for it and magnify the trivial events so that they gain high priority. Actually, it is meant to thicken our knowledge about the events and to fill in the previous omissions. It is a way of adding layers to the events that instructs us how to view the past. Therefore, Geertz has called this rhetorically self-conscious ethnographic practice as thick description. Here, Louis Montrose says about thick description. It might be more accurately described as an interpretive narration. It seizes on an event, performance, or other practice, and through the interrogation of its minute particulars, seeks to reveal the ethos of an alien culture. So here the main tendency is to uncover the ideological commitments in the text. It is deeply interested in looking at the way the text represents the direction and the values of any culture in a prevailing social system in order to provide the text as evidences of the basic cultural pattern. Next, let us see how the beliefs of traditional historicism have become outdated and the emergence of new historicism. According to the traditional historicists, history provides a backdrop and a context for the better understanding of literary texts that you all know. In this view, history is treated as a record of real events. Such a record of past reality could be used in writing and reading of literary texts. In such a notion of history, the literary writer and reader could never alter history. However, the new historicists attempt to abandon this notion of history that it regards history as a form of writing. So Greenblatt defines the traditional historical study as old historicism. So old historicism that tends to be monological. If the old kind of historicism tended to be monological, concerned with the discovery of a single political vision, identical with that said to be held by the entire literate class, but the new historicism looks upon the history of a culture as a history of all its products, literature being just one such product, social organization another product, the legal apparatus yet another product. So this is the statement by Greenblatt. So old historicism studies history as an end in itself and literary texts as an object produced by history's operation. It limits its scope within the particular historical movement that is presented in the literary. Therefore, the author is considered irrelevant and takes a secondary position. So, Christopher Hill states the great tragedians and the metaphysical poets are not dealing with human condition with man, but they deal with specific problems which confronted rulers and their subjects in a specific historical situation. Thus, they read literature of the past in its historical context in terms of beliefs, customs, rituals, institutions of that time and place to which the work of art belonged to. The American critic Thomas Brooks says that the term historicism itself causes a problem because it is often used with little awareness of its complicated history in English, a lack of awareness that is damning for any movement claiming to take history seriously. While interpreting literature in the context of history, old historicists fail to see the full intertextual network in which a literary work exists. This leads to the emergence of a new concept. Next, the literary critic Lee Patterson states that old historicism has manifested itself in two ways during the 19th century. First, the 19th century literary historicism shared a widespread assumption that historiography was capable of achieving an objectivity and reliability that other forms of cultural understanding like literary criticism could not achieve. Second, they assumed that each part of a culture was governed by the values that informed the whole. and it is tended to construct its determinative historical context and homogeneous and even monolithic terms. There, the paradigm for viewing history has been changed and the new concept arised. The modern concept of reality is that any event takes place not in history but through history. Therefore, history becomes a temporary component of reality. This reality undergoes a continual transformation that necessitates continual rewritings of history. Therefore, new historicism is differentiated from old historicism in the following ways: in a way of understanding the past, in the practice of giving equal weighting to literary and non literary material, by encouraging the parallel reading of literary and non literary texts, by giving equal importance to history as well as literature, by considering history as a text and literature as another text, by revisiting history through literary texts, it situates the literary text in the excluded areas of history, made between literary text and history. So it is obvious that the new historicist subject is not people in history, but texts in history. New historicists argue that the meanings of literary and historical texts are linguistically constructed by the interpretive critic or historian. Therefore, both literature and history are considered as the products of the same culture, and both should be read and treated together in its present context. So, from this point, a novelist can also be treated as a historian. So Rosenberg explains this view that a novelist could create a diverse, contentious part always in the process of being formed. Rather than encouraging the study of past, novelists could allow one to enter into it and see to it from the perspective of those for whom it was present. The past, therefore, will have a kind of presentness in the novel. Therefore, the historians are embracing the situation of novelists whose works always compete with but can never supplant one another. New historicism in general has got some basic methods in its dealing with the literary and historical texts. In order to define the perspectives, locations, cultures, and social systems of literature or history, it becomes necessary for the new historicist to establish some basic methods that focus on the ideology within the text. Each method employs a valuable outlook that helps the theorist in reading of the text. The basic method of new historicism is to establish a new relationship to the past to create a new awareness of how history and culture define each other. New historicism considers the text and co-text as expression of the same historical moment and interprets the text accordingly. Their aim is to clarify that the text is a kind of document which is made up of language. It describes the author as having a past that determines the manner and style in which the author has written the text. It also grasps the historical forces that shaped the literary text initially. Thus, the new historicists bring out the circumstances that make the writer to produce the work of art. The historical details, the events, the narrative, and the cultural codes are analyzed in detail to make the text parallel to any historical text of the period. They believe that history is a linguistically constructed text and it is available only through the ideology or outlook or discursive practices of its own time, then through those of ours, finally through the distorting web of language itself. So they believe in remaking any written text by juxtaposing the text with a chosen document. Thereby, a new entity is formed. Therefore, they present a new reality by resituating the past in the present situation. They look to a greater variety of discourses like social, political, religious, and artistic to help explain the text. So, according to them, text is an intersection of discourses that establishes a dominant ideology. They look at all sorts of other texts of the same period to best understand the text. Therefore, they criticize and question the values of literary texts in juxtaposition to non-literary texts. They refuse to privilege the literary text or historical text. They give equal weight to literary and non-literary texts, which, according to them, constantly inform and interrogate each other. They place literary texts within the frame of non-literary texts and reread the text largely in the network of other historical discourses to trace the connections among text, discourses, and context. Next, critics and practitioners of New Historicism sometimes differed by their assumptions and methodologies in certain aspects. They use New Historical theory in multiple ways in order to find new reading methods that would highlight the mutual dependency of the text and context. Actually, the concerns shared by the New Historicists and their various modes of analysis shape the terrain of New Historicism. Stephen Greenblatt, a critic of Renaissance literature, has noted a set of governing conditions in his Renaissance self-fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare that are common to most instances of self-fashioning of the authors themselves or of their characters. Greenblatt explains self-fashioning as self-fashioning occurs at the point of encounter between an authority and an alien. That is, what is produced in this encounter partakes both the authority and the alien, that is marked for attack, and hence that any achieved identity always contains within itself the signs of its own subversion or loss. Greenblatt believes in methodological self-consciousness that becomes the distinguishing mark of New Historicism. New historicists relate a work of art and the historical events to which it refers with a set of terms like allusion, symbolization, allegorization, representation, and mimesis. So Greenblatt has been much influenced by Michael Foucault and Clifford Geertz' functional anthropology. Geertz' anthropological studies of culture in Southeast Asia and North Africa provided new historicists with the new ways of thinking about culture. His anecdotal introductions and his notion of thick descriptions offered a model for Greenblatt. Greenblatt describes his own project of historical inquiries as a form of cultural poetics. To him, New Historicism is interested in the questions of circulation, of negotiation, of exchange. They take up these positions to claim that all cultural activities may be considered as equally important for historical analysis and try to discover the traces, margins, and things left unsaid instead of discussing the character, theme, and language of a literary text. The French philosopher and historian Michael Foucault, he believes in Nietzsche's will to power. According to Foucault, discourse is power. Foucault's interest in issues of power, epistemology, subjectivity, and ideology has influenced critics not only in literary studies but also in political science, history, and anthropology. He insists upon the historical dimension of discursive change. The idea imposed upon history will change from one era to another. There is no single history. There are discontinuous and contradictory histories propagated by the ruling classes in their own interests. Foucault brings together incidents even from unconnected areas to redefine the boundaries of historical inquiry. He looks to many types of discourses that reveal history. The discursive formations massively determine and constrain the nature of the subject. New historicists connect every event of history into a vast web of economical, social, and political factors. So his views, Foucault views history in terms of power, which produces and determines what really happens. So this is the statement by Foucault. You can read it on the screen. Relations of power are not in a position of exteriority with respect to other types of relationships, but are immanent in the latter They are the immediate effects of the divisions, inequalities, and disequilibriums which occur in the later, and conversely, they are the internal conditions of these differentiations. So, the concept of immanence and the concept of productivity are inseparable. Through his work, he explored the relationship between hegemonic power of discourse and the subject of both language and history in a broad critique of social and historical relation. He challenged the stable forms of all rationalized thought underlying methodology. He was against complete totalization, such as dialectical thinking. He came to the conclusion that ideological hierarchies and the operation of social institution are specific operations of power. Therefore, Foucault insists that the textual and subtly aesthetizing nature of studying history and the historicity of texts. Louis Montrose has observed the post-structuralist orientation to history as a reciprocal concern with the historicity of text and the textuality of history. New historicism understands history both as what happened in the past and also who made the past. He describes the relationship between history and text as a circle, that history is marked by textuality and texts are marked by history. There is no single text that can produce history essentially, because history takes place in every text. He argues against representations of history. So you can view it on my screen. Representations of the world in written discourse or engaged in constructing the world and shaping the modalities of social reality and in accommodating their writers, performers, readers, and audiences to multiple and shifting positions within the world they both constitute and inhabit. Therefore, a full and authentic history remains unavailable. New historians construe history as a form of textuality that is fragmented and partial, is meditated by texts. So they recognize not only the past in history, but also the critic and historian exist in history. He explains, Montrose explains further, writing and reading are always historically and socially determinate events performed in the world and upon the world by gendered individual and collective human agents. Therefore, new historicists situate the literary text in relationship to other genres, modes of discourses, and also to non-discursive practices to understand the textual constructions of the critics and writers who, according to them, are themselves historical subjects. So it is clear that history cannot be divorced from textuality. The historical text and the literary text reciprocate and reshape each other. Next, Catherine Gallagher, a recognized practitioner of New Historicism, assumes that New Historicism entails reading literary and non-literary texts as constituents of historical discourses that are both inside and outside of text, and its practitioners generally posit no fixed hierarchy of cause and effect, as they trace the connections among texts, discourses, power, and the constitution of subjectivity. So Gallagher admires these issues of New Historicist study, that they have kindled speculation about their own discursive contexts, commitments to and negotiations of power, or the constitution of their historical subjectivity. Gallagher has actually broken the concept of identifying New Historicism with Marxism. She explains the nominal compulsion to Marxism to achieve consistency, whereas New Historicism is rarely bound with compulsions. She points out that New Historicism confronts Marxism in a way that it is an amplified recorder of Marxism's unsatisfying methods. Next, Elizabeth Fox Genovese. According to Fox Genovese, New Historicism consists in a plethora of converging and conflicting tendencies within cultural studies. It takes up historicism and thick description to restore something new to the reading of text. For her, They concern the relation between the canonized texts of high culture and the culture at large, and the appropriate strategies for reading any text. Or to put it differently, the previous generations have bequeathed to use the interlocking problems of which text to be read and of how to read them. It means New Historicism has appropriated new strategies to the reading of literary and historical texts. For Fox Genevers, the New Historicist aim is to restore women, working people, and other marginal groups to the discussion of literary texts. Next, Thomas Brooke. Thomas Brooke defines New Historicism as a common label for literary critics' renewed interest in history. As a new historicist, Brooke talks about the temporality of reality in texts, which necessitate revisions. So long as temporality is a component part of reality, reality undergoes continual transformations that necessitate continual rewritings of history. So, New Historicism claims for newness in history, which, according to New Historicism, is a product of the writer's own ideological formation. Next, Frank Lentrichia. According to Lentrichia, the New Historicists look upon a literary text not as a reflection on the background of stable and unified historical fact, but as a fact that gives shape to the historical truth. He explains the mainstream historicist must therefore practice a triple repression. First, of his own active participation in the creation of the history he thinks he objectively mirrors. Second, of the interest ridden complicity of the literature that he studies in the shaping of what we are given as history. Third, of the political conflict of dominant and subaltern social groups, which presumably constitutes literature's true shape and content. In short, he covers up the struggle with monologue. New historicists take much effort to analyze the relationship between literary and historical texts in order to avoid the determinist schemas of understanding. Next, Judith Lower Newton. Judith Lower Newton states that there is no transhistorical or universal human essence, that the human subjectivity is constructed by cultural codes which position and limit all of us in various and divided ways. It means that the subject positions of literary and historical texts are linguistically constructed and created by various discourses of a given culture. Therefore, new historicists are against the concept of objectivity in history. Her assumption is, you can see it on my screen, there is no objective, that we experience the world in language, and that all our representations of the world, our readings of the text and of the past are informed by our own historical position, by the values and politics that are rooted in them. They emphasize the past is represented, and this representation makes things happen by shaping human consciousness, and that as forces acting in history. Various forms of representation ought to be read in relation to each other and in relation to non-discursive texts like events. Thus, literary texts can have a link with many other social and cultural phenomena of the period and should be read accordingly. Now, we are in the last part of my presentation to see how new historical strategies are applied to the reading of literary texts. For example, I have chosen for analysis Toni Morrison, an Afro-American writer, and her text, The Bluest Time. The Afro-American literature began with the desire to define the racial self. We all know the blacks felt that the whites were misrepresenting their case, and so they wished to plead for themselves. To avoid the danger of people believing the images created by whites in mainstream historical texts, the Afro-American writers took much effort to represent for themselves as good and positive in literary texts. They thought literary writing as an excellent medium for preserving their religious, political, and social customs. It was only in the beginning of the 20th century there was a conscious effort in the making of Afro American literature that explores the unique black expression. This aspiration to be black in form and content was known as Harlem Renaissance. Actually, revision and rewriting of the cultural hegemony of the colonizers have become a major strategy for the writers in the third world countries. They have taken up images and narratives to explain their cultural problems, hopes, and obsessions. Their works refract, and try to work through the contemporaneous issues, anxieties, and struggles. So they use post-structuralism and new historicism to question universalisms of Eurocentric writings. They hope to revise and rewrite the marginalized concepts and histories. Therefore, new historicism provides a best framework for them for interpreting literature in its historical context and becomes a powerful strategy for such writers to decolonize and do away with oppressive structures. The reading of Morrison largely reflect the facts about the history of Afro Americans. Her text, The Blue Eyes Child, depicts the tragic life of a young black girl, Pecola Breedlove, who wants nothing more than to be loved by her family and her society. She surmises that her skin color is a lot darker than most other black people, and she is ostracized as ugly by the people around her. Her desire to be loved by everyone sublimates into a desire to have blue eyes, white skin, and blonde hair like the white actress Shirley Temple. Instead of getting love and support from her parents, she has been isolated in her own family. Moreover, her trauma escalates when her own father rapes her. Her mother finds heaven, hope, life, and meaning, and everything as a servant to be to the rich white family. In this situation, Pecola is unable to endure the brutality towards her frail self-image. She becomes mad and withdraws into a world of fantasy, where she develops an imaginary friend to whom she talks about her beautiful blue eyes. So here in this text, most of the events of 1940s that occur in the text mirror the time period. As a black girl who did grow up in the 1940s, Morrison knows that the hardships endured by a black girl in the society. The events are set in Morrison's hometown of Lorraine, Ohio. Morrison takes up the life of a poor, innocent, ugly little black girl to show the negative effect of the white society's ideas and views on every individual's life. It appears as if the events that take place in the text are real, and the characters are the representatives of the raising black community in the North. The problems, situations, and dilemmas dealt by the characters were perhaps really faced by the black people during the 1940s. Actually, the story is set in the background of the post-World War I and the continuing migration northward. Charlie Breedlove and Pauline are portrayed as the black northern newcomers of that time. Charlie is full of rage from his childhood days. He develops this rage even going to the extreme of madness that he rapes his own daughter. Therefore, Charlie becomes the representative character of any misunderstood black male adult of that period, and thus he is considered as a part of the generation that started their life, their community in the North. His wife, Pauline, is a mammy to a white family and becomes the representative of the black society that tried too hard to conform to the white culture. The character of Pecola represents every black female child who desires the acceptance and love from the society. Morrison has portrayed Pecola as a young child who has been terribly impressed and affected by the white standard of beauty, which turns her life upside down and in the end leads her to madness. Therefore, Morrison in this text describes describes the conditions under which the black people in general and Pecola in particular are forced to live. It shows that Morrison is bringing in the struggles and sufferings of black people during the important historical events. By identifying their sex, race, and social standard, Morrison establishes the so far marginalized history of black people and explores the complexities of interracial prejudice. The narrative style that Morrison has taken up to illustrate the pain of a black girl in white America reflects Morrison's powerful craft of narrating the reality as a story. And the story is told by a narrator who is still a child, and that the world is seen through her eyes. The little black girl named Claudia. The text begins with a small passage. The passage is on the screen from Dick and Jane Primer. I think it is visible to you on the screen. Then it is repeated without standard punctuation or capitalization, but closely resembles the first passage. The second and third passages are on the screen now for you. So it is repeated again, but run through together without spaces or distinction between words. So the first version signifies the standard white family. Now the first version is on the screen. It signifies the standard white family. It is a Dick and Jane Primer. Now the second and third version are there. The second signifies the struggling black family, and the third signifies the completely damaged black family of Pecola. Further, the text has 4 seasons as its chapter headings. This indicates that the events described under each chapter is not all about a particular family of a particular historical period, but the events will happen again in present as well as in future, like the all 4 seasons. This technique symbolically pictures how the impact of white people's familial system damages the life of blacks. Morrison has also made use of metaphors like marigolds and dandelions to describe the conditions under which the African Americans are forced to live. The children Claudia and Freda plant the marigold seeds with the belief that if the marigolds grow, definitely Pecola's baby would survive. But there were no marigolds. The land of the entire country was hostile to marigolds that year. This soil is bad for certain kinds of flowers. Certain seeds it will not nurture. Certain fruit it will not bear. And when the land kills of its own volition, we acquaint and say the victim had no right to live. This is how Morrison implies that the soil that is inherently racist would never give a chance to black people to grow and survive. It reveals the literary writer's extraordinary sense of history, her powerful handling of language, and her in-depth knowledge of culture. In my slide, you can see the statement by Mobley that the bluest eye told more truth than many of us had ever thought or dared to speak about the damage racism and sexism had done to us or to our image of ourselves. Morrison's use of history is also a form of cultural intervention designed to interrupt and critique the present for those who never learned their history, those who forgot it, and those who neglected or refused to pass it on. So this is how New Historicism has become a viable theory that has brought in a different and invigorating perception to literary texts. In this perception, literary texts are not anymore imaginary creations to be read in leisure time, but active texts debating actualities, invigorating and investing the historical events of a race or a country. Thank you for your patient listening. Over to Sangeeta, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Very informative session, ma'am. That definitely it will be a helpful one to all the students, because this literary criticism is taken place in all our universities. For that sake only, I have chosen this topic for us to present in our webinar, ma'am. Thank you so much. Very informative about your webinar, your presentation, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. No questions at all in our chat box, ma'am. It is clearly no, to the participants.
Thank you so much for the elite participants, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
yeah, yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Good evening, madam.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes,
Hello.
sir. Yes, sir. Please.
Am I audible?
Sir, please.
Yes, I am
Yes, sir.
head of the Department of English and Vice Principal of Srikakulam, Gayatri College of Science and Management, Andhra Pradesh. Let me thank you first, madam. You have chosen very good speakers, and today's speakers are very good, especially Devika, madam. She has elaborated all the things in a lucid manner with fine example. At the same time, I congratulate her on her flow of language. That's very, very important for English.
Thank you, sir.
She has presented very well. So I noted each and every point what you mentioned so far. That's why I request you all, especially Sangeeta madam, to share the PPTs. What are maybe the webinars? This may be the fourth or fifth webinar I attended. Each and every webinar has its unique nature and each and everything. And I think many of the participants might have utilized this information, and they may use in their classroom sessions to make their students wonderful of part India. Thank you very much, madam.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your appreciation.
Most welcome.
Thank you for the feedback, sir.
Thank you.
I will send both of the PPTs in the groups.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for his proposing vote of thanks to Dr. Devaki ma'am, because always I am searching persons to propose the vote of thanks, and I itself gave the vote of thanks, but sir has given vote of thanks for that.
It's my privilege. It's my pleasure. It's my duty.
Oh, okay, sir. Because the one of the participants has given the vote of thanks, it's most welcome. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Yes, I have sent the link, feedback link in the chat box and also in the YouTube live stream. Please fill it before 6 o'clock. After that, I will close it. So kindly fill it before 6 o'clock, dear participants. And our next webinar on next Sunday. The topic is American literature. I'm not fixing the topic in a proper way, but it will be taken place on American literature. And I will send the brochures and the invitations through our groups, and you register it and present in the webinar. Thank you. Thank you, one and all.